put your phone or device aside and immerse yourself in this audio story. Perfect for listening on the move, while relaxing, or for bedtime listening. We release new stories daily, so make sure to like and subscribe to not miss out. This story is based on true events. When money bought monsters. In the shadowy corridors of Hollywood power, where fortunes are made and reputations manufactured, there existed a financial empire built on silence. For decades, one man didn't just produce Oscar-winning films. He constructed an intricate web of money, legal shields, and institutional complicity that protected something far darker than box office failures. This is the story of how Harvey Weinstein's reign of terror wasn't just enabled by Hollywood's culture of fear. It was financed, insured, and systematically funded by some of the most powerful institutions in global business. Behind every settlement, every silenced victim, every covered-up allegation, there was a money trail that led to boardrooms far beyond Tinseltown. This is a dark business story about the financial machinery that bankrolled a monster. The year is 2005, and the Weinstein Company is born from the ashes of Miramax, the studio Harvey and his brother Bob built into an indie film powerhouse before selling to Disney. But this isn't just another Hollywood startup story. This is the construction of a financial fortress designed with a dual purpose. On the surface, it would produce prestige cinema and chase golden statues. Beneath that glittering facade, it would become a mechanism for covering up one of the entertainment industry's darkest secrets. To understand how a serial predator operated with impunity for 30 years, you must follow the money. And the money tells a story far more disturbing than most business scandals. Because this wasn't just about one man's crimes. This was about an entire financial ecosystem that chose profit over protection, returns over responsibility, institutional reputation over individual safety. Goldman Sachs, the pinnacle of Wall Street prestige, didn't just finance Harvey Weinstein's films. They financed his ability to silence his accusers. In 2010, the investment banking giant arranged a $375 million credit facility for the Weinstein Company, a financial lifeline that kept the studio afloat even as internal complaints mounted and settlements multiplied. But Goldman's involvement went deeper than typical corporate lending. They were intimately familiar with the company's financial health, which meant they had access to the balance sheets showing mysterious legal settlements, the unusual payouts to former employees, the pattern of non-disclosure agreements that peppered the company's expenditures, like bloodstains on expensive carpet. Every major financial institution conducts due diligence before extending credit. They examine risks, they investigate red flags, they ask questions about irregular spending patterns. Yet Goldman Sachs continued funding operations at a company where the cost of silencing women was simply another line item in the corporate budget. The financing web extended beyond traditional banks into the elite world of private equity. Lion Capital, Colony Capital, Worldview Entertainment Partners. These weren't naive investors stumbling blindly into a bad deal. These were sophisticated financial players who demanded detailed information about every aspect of the business they were funding. They sat in board meetings. They reviewed quarterly reports. They analyzed cash flows and expenditure patterns. And somewhere in those spreadsheets and financial statements were the settlements. Payments to women who had encountered Harvey Weinstein's predatory behavior and been offered money in exchange for their silence and their trauma. In 2015, Colony Capital invested in the Weinstein Company, despite the fact that by this point, settlements and allegations had been circulating in Hollywood for years. The whispers were loud enough that journalists had been investigating, that victims had been trying to speak out, that insiders knew the truth. Yet the capital kept flowing, because in the cold calculus of billionaire secrets and corporate scandal, the potential returns outweighed the moral considerations. This is the dark business story that Hollywood doesn't want told. Not just about one predator, but about the financial system that funded his reign. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of Harvey Weinstein's financing web wasn't the investors who chose to look away. It was the insurance companies that actively participated in the cover-up. Chubb Limited, one of the world's largest insurance providers, didn't just insure the Weinstein Company against normal business risks. They provided directors and officers liability insurance, coverage specifically designed to protect company executives from claims of misconduct. And for years, Chubb paid out settlements on Harvey Weinstein's behalf, transforming what should have been personal accountability into a corporate insurance claim. Think about the perverse incentive structure this created. A system where a serial predator could assault women knowing that the financial consequences would be absorbed by an insurance policy, leaving his personal wealth untouched and his behavior effectively subsidized by institutional capital. Between 1990 and 2017, it's estimated that at least 8 settlements were paid to women who accused Weinstein of sexual harassment or assault. The exact amounts remain sealed behind non-disclosure agreements, but legal experts estimate the total runs into millions of dollars, millions that came not from Weinstein's personal accounts, but from insurance policies and corporate funds. The insurance companies knew. They had to know. Each claim generated paperwork, investigations, risk assessments. Yet they continued providing coverage, continued paying out, continued enabling. The Weinstein Company's own corporate structure reveals another layer of this financial mystery. A business model seemingly designed to obscure accountability and complicate oversight. The company operated through a complex network of subsidiaries, production entities, and licensing agreements that made tracking money flows deliberately difficult. There was TWC, Dimension Films, Miramax when they still controlled it, international distribution arms, production partnerships, a maze of corporate entities that allowed funds to move through channels that made external auditing nearly impossible. This wasn't accidental. This is a common strategy in businesses with something to hide. Create enough corporate complexity that unwinding the financial threads becomes prohibitively expensive and time-consuming for regulators, journalists, or victims seeking accountability. The money behind the monster wasn't simple. It was deliberately, strategically complicated. And that complexity served as its own form of protection, a financial fog that obscured the true cost of Harvey Weinstein's behavior and made it easier for investors and insurers to claim plausible deniability. In the world of wealth and power, complexity isn't a bug. It's a feature designed to protect those at the top of the pyramid. But here's where this dark business story takes a turn that exposes something even more sinister about the financial machinery protecting Harvey Weinstein. The Weinstein Company's own board of directors was directly complicit in funding the cover-ups, and they did it with full knowledge of what they were financing. In October 2015, a female employee filed an internal complaint about Harvey Weinstein's behavior. The complaint was detailed, credible, and disturbing. The board's response wasn't to fire him, investigate thoroughly, or report to authorities. Instead, they authorized a settlement. Corporate money used to silence yet another victim. But more damning than the settlement itself was what happened next. The board members gave Harvey Weinstein permission to continue running the company with virtually no restrictions, no monitoring, no consequences beyond writing a check that wouldn't even come from his personal bank account. Board member Dirk Ziff, heir to the Ziff Davis publishing fortune, he knew. Board member Mark Lasry, billionaire hedge fund manager, he knew. Board member Tim Bennett, former president of the National Cable and Telecommunications Association, he knew. These weren't naive bystanders. These were sophisticated businessmen with fiduciary responsibilities, legal obligations, and moral compasses that somehow all pointed toward protecting a predator, as long as he kept producing Oscar-winning films and generating returns on investment. The business crime here wasn't just Weinstein's assaults. It was the systematic corporate decision to finance his ability to continue committing them. The true scale of the financial conspiracy becomes even clearer when you examine the Weinstein Company's relationship with talent agencies, the gatekeepers who controlled access to Hollywood's most valuable commodity, stars. Creative Artists Agency, William Morris Endeavor, United Talent Agency. These weren't just representing actors who worked with Weinstein. They were actively packaging projects with him, collecting fees for deals that put their clients directly into the path of a known predator, and in some cases, allegedly helping to cover up incidents when they occurred. CAA reportedly knew about Weinstein's behavior as early as the 1990s, yet continued sending actresses to meet with him for film roles, often in hotel rooms, often alone, often in situations that created vulnerability by design. Why? Because Harvey Weinstein represented money. He could greenlight projects, secure financing, deliver Oscar campaigns that turned B-list actors into A-list stars. The agencies collected 10% of every deal, which meant they had direct financial incentive to maintain good relationships with Weinstein, even if that meant exposing their clients to danger. This is the hidden machinery of Hollywood power. Not just one monster, but an entire ecosystem of financial interests aligned to protect him, because his success generated revenue streams for dozens of companies and thousands of employees whose paychecks depended on not asking uncomfortable questions. The money trail doesn't just implicate Weinstein. It implicates an entire industry that chose financial returns over human safety. Perhaps the most disturbing financial relationship in Harvey Weinstein's web was with the law firms that represented him, not just as corporate counsel, but as active architects of the silencing machine. Boies Schiller Flexner, led by legendary attorney David Boies, didn't just defend Weinstein in legal proceedings. According to reports, the firm hired former Israeli intelligence operatives from Black Cube to surveil and intimidate women who were considering speaking to journalists about Weinstein's behavior. This wasn't legal defense. This was psychological warfare, funded with corporate dollars and orchestrated by a firm that billed itself as defenders of justice. The Black Cube operatives posed as women's rights advocates, as journalists, as potential employers. Anything to get close to Weinstein's accusers, extract information about what they planned to say, and report back to Weinstein's team so they could strategize how to silence them. The cost of this operation, reportedly over $1 million, paid through legal fees that the Weinstein Company classified as ordinary business expenses. David Boies, who had built a reputation representing Al Gore in Bush versus Gore and fighting for marriage equality in California, was simultaneously being paid by the New York Times to represent them in legal matters, while his firm was helping Harvey Weinstein spy on the Times reporters investigating the allegations against him. The conflict of interest was staggering, but the money made it worthwhile, at least until the story broke, and Boies faced professional consequences for his role in the cover-up. This is what wealth and power can buy. Not just lawyers, but private intelligence operations that would make corporate espionage look tame by comparison. The financing web extended into international waters through offshore accounts and complex corporate structures designed to move money across borders with minimal transparency. The Weinstein Company had business relationships with international distributors, foreign production companies, and overseas investors, all of which created opportunities to route funds through jurisdictions with weaker disclosure requirements and stronger privacy protections. While there's no public evidence that Weinstein used these structures specifically to hide settlement payments, The opacity of international film financing creates natural cover for financial transactions that companies don't want scrutinized. A settlement paid through a British subsidiary, a licensing fee that's actually a disguised payout, a production deal structured to compensate a victim without calling it compensation. These are the gray zones where corporate scandal meets creative accounting, and the truth becomes almost impossible to uncover without subpoena power and forensic auditors willing to dig through years of international financial records. The global nature of film financing means that money trails cross borders, pass through multiple corporate entities, and become deliberately tangled in ways that serve the interests of those who benefit from opacity. Harvey Weinstein operated in an industry where moving money across borders, structuring deals through intermediaries, and maintaining financial privacy weren't unusual. They were standard practice, which made hiding misconduct easier than it would be in more transparent industries. But the financial protection didn't just come from investors, insurers, and lawyers. It came from the basic economics of Hollywood itself, where Harvey Weinstein's power was protected by his ability to make everyone around him rich. Between 1989 and 2017, films produced by Weinstein's companies won more than 300 Oscar nominations and 81 Academy Awards. The Weinstein Company generated billions in revenue through box office receipts, distribution deals, streaming rights, and international sales. Every actor who won an Oscar in a Weinstein film saw their salary demands increase exponentially. Every investor who backed a Weinstein production that became a critical and commercial success made multiples on their investment. Every distributor who partnered with the Weinstein Company collected fees and percentages that justified their quarterly earnings reports to shareholders. This created a perverse economic reality. Harvey Weinstein's criminal behavior was protected not despite his success, but because of it. He had made too many people too much money for anyone to want to risk killing the golden goose, even when they knew the goose was a predator. This is the dark truth about entrepreneurship secrets and billionaire secrets. Sometimes the secret is that success can buy immunity, that wealth can purchase protection, that making other people rich is the most effective form of insurance against accountability. The money behind the monster wasn't just financing his behavior. It was creating a financial incentive structure where everyone around him had reasons to look the other way, to dismiss the rumors, to accept the settlements as an unfortunate cost of doing business with a difficult genius. Then came the revelation that broke open the entire financial conspiracy and exposed just how deep the institutional complicity ran. The Weinstein Company's own insurance policies contained clauses that specifically carved out coverage for sexual misconduct that the company was already aware of before the policies were issued. Think about what this means. The insurance companies weren't naive. They knew Harvey Weinstein posed a sexual misconduct risk because they'd already paid previous claims. So they added clauses to future policies that essentially said, "We'll insure you for new incidents, but not for the ones we already know about." Which means the Weinstein Company was shopping for insurance coverage specifically designed to cover future sexual misconduct claims while excluding past ones, and insurance companies were willing to sell them that coverage. This wasn't ignorance or negligence. This was conscious, calculated participation in a system designed to allow Harvey Weinstein to continue his behavior with financial protection in place for when victims came forward. Even more disturbing, when victims later tried to sue the Weinstein Company and go after the insurance policies that had paid previous settlements, they discovered that many of the policies contained mandatory arbitration clauses and confidentiality provisions that made it nearly impossible to publicly litigate or expose the full extent of the financial cover-up. The money trail had been designed with legal tripwires and contractual landmines specifically intended to make accountability as difficult and expensive as possible. This is financial engineering in service of evil, using sophisticated corporate structures, insurance products, and legal agreements not to manage legitimate business risk, but to enable ongoing criminal behavior by insulating the perpetrator from consequences. When the Weinstein scandal finally broke in October 2017, with Ronan Farrow and Jodi Kantor's investigative reporting, the financial unraveling was swift and brutal, but not for Harvey Weinstein himself. At least, not initially. The Weinstein Company filed for bankruptcy in March 2018, owing more than $300 million to creditors and facing dozens of lawsuits from victims seeking compensation. But in the bankruptcy proceedings, a disturbing pattern emerged. The company's assets were being carved up in ways that prioritized secured creditors, the banks and investors who had financed operations, over the unsecured creditors, which included many of Weinstein's victims seeking damages. This is how corporate bankruptcy law works in America. The money flows up, not down. The sophisticated financial players who made calculated bets on the Weinstein Company's success got their money back first, at least partially. The women who had been assaulted, silenced, and forced to sign NDAs in exchange for settlements that never adequately compensated them for their trauma. They stood in line behind the hedge funds and investment banks. Meanwhile, Harvey Weinstein himself had already moved assets into trusts, real estate holdings, and legal structures that made it difficult for victims to reach his personal wealth. His Connecticut mansion, his Manhattan apartments, his art collection, all protected through legal mechanisms that wealthy defendants use to shield assets from civil liability. The financial machinery that had enabled his behavior for decades was now protecting his wealth even as his empire collapsed. The bankruptcy sale of the Weinstein Company revealed another layer of the financial mystery. Who would want to buy a company so thoroughly tainted by scandal, and what they were really purchasing? Lantern Capital Partners, a Dallas-based private equity firm, acquired the company's assets for approximately $289 million in July 2018. But what they were buying wasn't just a film library and distribution contracts. They were buying hundreds of hours of content, including footage that might contain evidence of Weinstein's behavior, contracts with talent that might contain damaging clauses, and corporate records that could expose even more participants in the cover-up. The bankruptcy sale process was controversial because victims' advocates argued that Weinstein's victims should have received more compensation before any assets were sold to new owners. Instead, the bankruptcy court approved a deal that gave secured creditors most of the proceeds, while victims received a fraction of what they were owed and were required to sign new releases, preventing them from pursuing additional claims against the company's former board members and executives in exchange for their settlement payments. This is the final insult in the financial story. Even after the scandal broke, even after Harvey Weinstein was arrested and charged with multiple counts of sexual assault, the financial system still prioritized protecting institutional players over compensating victims. The money behind the monster didn't disappear when the monster was exposed. It just reorganized, restructured, and found new forms to protect itself. Looking at the full scope of Harvey Weinstein's financing web reveals uncomfortable truths about how institutional capital enables abuse when the potential returns justify the moral compromise. Goldman Sachs faced no criminal charges for financing a company they had to know was using corporate funds to silence sexual assault victims. The insurance companies that paid millions in settlements continued operating with minimal regulatory consequences. The board members who voted to authorize settlements and allow Weinstein to continue running the company faced civil lawsuits, but no criminal prosecution. David Boies faced professional criticism, but continued practicing law and representing high-profile clients. The talent agencies that sent actresses into dangerous situations maintained their business relationships and market dominance. The private equity firms that invested millions into the Weinstein Company, despite red flags, simply wrote off their losses as failed investments and moved on to the next deal. This is the dark reality of money and greed in corporate America. The financial system has evolved to protect institutional players, even when they participate in enabling criminal behavior, as long as they maintain plausible deniability and don't directly commit the crimes themselves. Harvey Weinstein is in prison, convicted of rape and sexual assault, serving a 39-year sentence. But the financial machinery that enabled him, protected him, and profited from him for 3 decades remains largely intact, still operating in boardrooms and investment committees where similar calculations are being made about other risky bets, where the potential returns might outweigh the moral concerns. The story of Harvey Weinstein's financing web is ultimately a business documentary about the price of complicity, not the price paid by the complicit parties, but the price extracted from their victims. Every settlement was a woman's trauma, converted into a line-item expense. Every insurance payout was a sexual assault, translated into actuarial risk. Every board meeting where executives decided to keep Harvey Weinstein in power was a calculation that his Oscar-winning productions were worth more than the safety of the women he would assault before he was finally stopped. The financial mystery at the heart of this dark business story isn't how Harvey Weinstein got away with it for so long. It's how many supposedly reputable institutions made conscious decisions to help him get away with it, because stopping him would have cost them money. Goldman Sachs could have refused to extend credit. The insurance companies could have cancelled policies after the first settlement. The board members could have fired him after any one of multiple complaints. The investors could have demanded oversight and accountability as conditions of their capital. The lawyers could have refused to participate in surveillance operations against victims. But they didn't, because in the cold logic of institutional finance, the potential losses from taking action exceeded the potential gains, and so they chose profit over principle, returns over responsibility, shareholder value over human dignity. Today, the lessons from Harvey Weinstein's financial empire echo through ongoing conversations about corporate accountability, institutional complicity, and whether capitalism's inherent focus on profit maximization creates systematic incentives that enable abuse when stopping. It would be expensive. The Me Too movement that followed the Weinstein scandal has forced some changes: more women in corporate leadership, stronger HR policies, increased scrutiny of settlement agreements, regulatory pressure on non-disclosure agreements that silence victims of sexual misconduct. But the fundamental tension remains unresolved. When powerful individuals generate enormous returns for investors, when they make everyone around them rich, when their success creates jobs and profits and bonuses throughout an entire ecosystem, the financial incentive structure still points toward protection rather than accountability, toward settlement rather than prosecution, toward silence rather than transparency. Harvey Weinstein's financing web wasn't an aberration. It was an extreme example of dynamics that exist throughout corporate America, wherever powerful individuals are deemed too valuable to hold accountable, too successful to stop, too important to the bottom line to sacrifice, even when the evidence of wrongdoing is overwhelming. The monster has been caged, but the machinery that funded him is still running, still making calculations about risk and reward, still deciding what price is worth paying to protect profitable relationships. In the end, the dark truth behind Harvey Weinstein's rise and fall isn't that one man was evil. It's that an entire financial system was willing to bankroll that evil as long as it came with Oscar nominations and healthy returns on investment. The money behind the monster reveals something more disturbing than any individual crime. It shows how institutional capital can become complicit in systematic abuse through 1,000 small decisions to prioritize profit over protection, to treat settlements as acceptable business expenses, to calculate that the reputational risk of exposure is less costly than the financial risk of taking action. Harvey Weinstein built an empire on violence and fear, but he didn't build it alone. He had partners in every bank that extended credit, knowing how the money would be used, every insurance company that paid settlements and renewed policies, every board member who voted to keep him in power, every investor who chose returns over responsibility. They were all architects of the financing web, all participants in the machinery that enabled decades of abuse. And somewhere tonight, in boardrooms and investment committees across the world, similar calculations are being made about other powerful individuals whose success generates profits for those around them, whose value to the bottom line outweighs concerns about their behavior, whose wealth buys them layers of protection that ordinary people could never afford. The secret file that was never supposed to see daylight is now open, but the institutions exposed within it continue operating, continue financing, continue making the same calculations about what price is worth paying to protect their most profitable relationships. That's the financial mystery that remains unsolved. Not how the monster was created, but how many supposedly respectable institutions were willing to fund him, protect him, and profit from him until his crimes finally became too public to ignore. Subscribe and listen to our next story below.